Hello there, I'm John and this is our brand new show All Time 10s XL. And for our first episode, we're going dark. So dark in fact that governments across the world wanted to hide all the facts that we're about to tell you. So stay tuned for undercover armies, shady networks and disgusting experiments in 10 shocking declassified secrets. Number 10, Project MK Ultra. Now it's no surprise that the CIA have been up to a whole load of shenanigans over the years, but despite all the coups, drug smuggling and that time they put a bomb inside a camel, this actually happened, to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan, we've settled for Project MK Ultra. For 2 decades, starting in the 1950s, the CIA tried to develop mind control techniques. Only problem was that in order to learn these techniques, they carried out hundreds of illegal experiments on innocent people without their consent, usually dosing them with LSD. One plan involved using prostitutes to lure unsuspecting test subjects back to a CIA safe house where they'd be given cocktails laced with acid. Now that might sound like a great night out, but in actual fact, CIA operatives would then watch the effect and the sex from behind a two-way mirror like a government-paid pervert. The little scheme was named Operation Midnight Climax, so at least the CIA do have a sense of humour even if they don't have a conscience. Please don't kill me, CIA, just on a little joke. You like a joke, don't you? They even conducted experiments in Canada that involved giving patients electroshock therapy 40 times the normal dose. Many had their memories destroyed or were left with the mental age of a toddler. Adjusted for inflation, this project cost over $100 million and has been linked to the death of at least one CIA agent, Frank Olson, who threw himself out of a 13th floor window after secretly being given a dose of LSD in 1953. The project became public knowledge in 1975, but 2 years before that, the CIA destroyed almost every document connected to MK Ultra. To be fair though, they were probably out of their minds on acid when they did it. Number 9, the Guy Pan Files. France is the only country in Europe that has a state-run team that investigates sightings of UFOs. And in 2007, that team, called Guy Pan, became the first space agency in the world to open up all of its documents detailing UFO sightings. More than 100,000 pages of evidence dating back to 1954 were dumped online, and I'm not going to lie to you, most of it wouldn't make for a good episode of The X-Files. Like one woman who reported seeing a flying toilet roll. I know it's hardly Independence Day, but some of the reports are a little harder to disprove. In 1994, an Air France crew reported a shape-shifting disc-like craft which was huge in size that suddenly disappeared from view. And the thing is, radar on the ground confirmed the story, and the sighting remains unexplained. Another incident involved the sighting of 4 small black beings just 120 centimeters tall landing on a farm in 1967. The witnesses and police reports all match, leaving the space agency to conclude that no rational explanation can be given for this event. In fact, out of the 1,600 cases revealed, almost 25% are classed as Type D. This means that despite good or very good data and credible witnesses, we are confronted with something we can't explain. In other words, 400 UFOs might have visited France in the last 50 years. Now I think it's time to call Mulder and Scully. Yeah, get on the blower. Fact number 8, Operation Northwoods. Ever thought all those people who said 9/11 was an inside job were crazy? Well, after you learn about Operation Northwoods, you might need to think again. Because believe it or not, the US government did once plan to attack its own citizens using staged terror attacks. The year was 1962 and the enemy was none other than Communist Cuba and their assassination-proof leader, Fidel Castro. With the Cold War in full swing, the USA couldn't stand having a communist neighbour on their back doorstep and wanted a bit of regime change. They do like that. They do like that, the USA. But they needed an excuse to invade the Caribbean island. Step forward, Operation Northwoods. This plan by the US military proposed various attacks that would be carried out by the CIA and then blamed on Cuba. These included sinking a US ship off the coast of Cuba, setting off bombs in Florida, and sinking boats carrying Cuban refugees, and wait for it, here's the dramatic music, hijacking planes. Now, President Kennedy rejected the plan, which remained secret until the late 1990s, but that hasn't stopped loads of 9/11 conspiracy theorists still bringing it up all the time. Just ask all-time conspiracies, it's all they talk about. northwards. Number 7, the Sverdlovsk incident. Now, you've probably never heard of the deadliest anthrax outbreak in modern history, and that's because it was covered up by the Soviet government. Approximately 100 people died in Sverdlovsk in the Soviet Union back in 1979 when a nearby bioweapons lab accidentally released some anthrax spores into the environment. Now, presumably someone was fired for this, because that is ridiculous. In fact, the disaster could have been far worse had the wind been blowing towards the city itself, with hundreds of thousands of people potentially infected. But instead of admitting to the incident, which would have violated the Biological Weapons Convention, the Soviet Union said the outbreak was natural. You know, just a big natural outbreak of anthrax that killed 100 people. Of course, no one could actually prove them wrong though, seeing as the KGB also destroyed the medical records of those infected. I mean, they are good at that, that's what they're there for. But in 1992, after the USSR collapsed, a team of inspectors was finally given access to the area and established the truth. Now, you might think that would be the end of the story, but it's not quite. You see, the facility was supposed to have been demilitarized since then, but instead its operations have been moved underground according to a few sources. Supposedly, scientists there are now working on a super anthrax that's been genetically modified to spread as fast as possible and to be extra hard to kill. Now, given what happened in the 1970s, I'm not sure I'd be too happy if I was one of the 1.5 million people living next door to this lab. Number 6, War Plan Red. On the international stage, the USA and the UK have been inseparable allies since 1941, and they haven't been to war with each other for 200 years. I mean, we'll gloss over that because we did burn down the White House. But in the 1920s, it was the USA who had drawn up the secret plans to attack the British Empire. They developed a full-scale invasion in case of a trade war with the UK. Known as War Plan Red, the US strategy involved attacking Canada, Jamaica, Barbados, and Bermuda, and it would have seen an estimated 6 million troops fighting along the eastern seaboard of America. And in 1935, the USA actually set aside $57 million to build 3 secret air bases along the Canadian border to help with bombing. They were even prepared to use chemical weapons against those good old Canadians during this proposed conflict. They'd also blockade all British trade in the Western Hemisphere, eventually forcing the UK to surrender. Of course, America planned on keeping all of the territory it invaded, so it would have been bye-bye Canada. The start of World War II in 1939, however, saw any likelihood of an Anglo-US war disappear. War Plan Red was made public in 1974 and caused a minor hiccup in US-Canadian relations, but we're all friends again now, and that's what matters. And we all work together to defeat the Nazis, which is probably more important than any of this. So, nice work. Number 5, Operation Gladio. If the Cold War had ever actually got hot and heavy, with an actual war, then things really wouldn't have looked that good for the West. The Eastern Bloc had more men, more tanks, and more planes. Pretty much they had more of everything. So NATO, expecting to lose, decided to set up a network of secret armies across the continent. In the event of a communist takeover, they'd fight a guerrilla war behind enemy lines in the hope of one day restoring democracy. That sounds like a great plan. After all, they are protecting democracy, right? Well, the thing is, it didn't turn out that way. In Italy, at least, this secret army named Gladio was responsible for organising a terrorist attack in 1972 that killed 3 military policemen. Worse still, they're linked with the 1980 Bologna train bombing that killed 85 innocent civilians. Each time, left-wing groups and local communists were framed for these acts. Why? To damage left-wing parties in elections and protect right-wing governments. So much for protecting democracy. These secret armies were so classified that several European leaders didn't even know they were operating in their own countries. And without Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti going public in 1990, we may never have found out at all, which is quite frankly terrifying. Number 4, the Ninos Robodos. Juan Luis Moreno's father was on his deathbed in 2011 in Spain when he leaned in to tell his son a huge secret. He wasn't actually his father. Juan had been bought from a nun. A DNA test with his mother confirmed the story. They were a 0% match, and no one knew who his biological parents were. He went to the press, and subsequent investigations found a huge secret network dedicated to stealing babies. This network was set up by the Spanish dictator Franco so he could steal the children of his political enemies and raise them with loyal families. But even after Franco died in 1975, Catholic priests and nuns continued the practice. taking children from so-called immoral or poor parents and selling them on to Catholic-approved families. The real parents were then told that their babies had died shortly after birth and fake burials were held. Meanwhile, bogus birth certificates were then created for the babies' new identities. The shocking practice took place for 50 years from the 1940s to the 1990s and led to up to 300,000 children being abducted. But less than 1,000 cases are actually being investigated. Number 3, the Katyn massacre. Hidden in the forests of Katyn in Russia, a horrible secret was waiting to be discovered among all the death and destruction of World War II. In 1943, Nazi Germany reported that it had found a mass grave of executed Polish soldiers and civilians. The total killed in the massacre is estimated to have been 22,000 people. And the Germans presented strong evidence that indicating that the Soviet Union were responsible. But the USSR dismissed this as German lies and propaganda. And indeed, when the Soviets took control of the Katyn site themselves later in the war, they miraculously discovered evidence that the Nazis had actually committed the atrocity. And at least one German POW was forced to confess to the crime in 1946. The thing is, this was all an act. The Soviet Union had committed the massacre. But instead, they framed the Germans and used their position with the Allies to keep the USA and the UK quiet. And after the war, they forced the Polish government to censor any mention of the crime. Documents confirming the truth weren't released until 1990, 50 years after the crime had been committed. Fact number 2, the plutonium files. In the 1990s, Eileen Welsom was working for a tiny regional newspaper, the Albuquerque Tribune. But like the plot of an awesome conspiracy thriller movie, she managed to reveal that the US government had exposed thousands of Americans to nuclear radiation in order to understand its effects. The exposure had been deliberate, but the patients involved had no idea that they were being tested on. The first experiments kicked off in 1945 and didn't stop for 30 years. The first tests involved 18 people who had plutonium injected directly into their bloodstream. One was a child aged just 4. Another, Albert Stevens, holds the record for surviving the largest radiation dose in any human. When he died at age 79, the accumulated radiation in his body was 1,280 times the permitted dose for a radiation worker in the United States. Somehow though, it gets even worse, as another test saw between 50 and 100 mentally disabled boys fed oatmeal containing radioactive isotopes. Meanwhile, 829 pregnant women in Tennessee were given radioactive iron. They were told that they would be given special vitamins that would make their babies grow up big and strong. Instead, their kids developed cancer at an early age and died, while their mums were left with blood disorders, skin diseases, and cancer themselves. These and many other experiments were exposed by Eileen Welsom after Bill Clinton made the documents available to the public in 1993, and a government report admitting to the tests was released on October 3rd, 1995, but no one was interested. And that's because it was put out on the same day as the O.J. Simpson trial concluded. Now that's convenient timing if you ask me. Fact number 1, Unit 731. World War II led to some of the worst war crimes in history, and amongst the most depraved, cruel and inhumane were those perpetrated by Japan's top secret, Unit 731. In the name of biowarfare research, prisoners, some of them children, were deliberately infected with diseases. They were then cut open or had limbs removed while still alive and without anaesthetic to see how it would affect them. Other experiments saw subjects being left outside until their limbs froze, being burned alive, or being placed into high-pressure chambers until their eyes literally popped from their sockets. By the time the war ended, Unit 731 had killed an estimated 250,000 people through their twisted experiments and destroyed much of the evidence. But the USA granted those responsible immunity and covered up their crimes in exchange for what they had learned. And when the Soviet Union imprisoned 12 Unit 731 members and released information about their actions in 1949, the Allies dismissed it as communist lies. And the truth was only revealed in the decades that followed, after some of those responsible admitted to what they had done. Otherwise, we may never have learned the extent of their crimes. Okay, so thankfully the horror is over now, and hopefully you haven't lost all faith in humanity. But if you want to delve deeper into the rabbit hole of conspiracy, then head over to our friends at All Time Conspiracies, where they literally do this sort of thing 3 or 4 times a week. They do some amazing videos, so be sure to check them out. And let us know what you thought about the new format too, and give us some suggestions for future topics. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.